Donald Trump was using negotiations as cover for this attack in order to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security. And while it's true that the Iranians were lulled, then that was a major mistake on their part.
Recently, Max Blumenthal went on Judge Napolitano's podcast to talk a little bit about Israel's recent strike in Iran. Who is more culpable in that strike, Trump or Netanyahu? I think his answer to that may surprise some people. And also, whether these negotiations were ever earnest in the first place. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
On national intelligence. Theoretically, she briefs him every day, and now he says he doesn't care what she says. She should probably resign.
Well, this is disgusting because she has displayed so much loyalty to Trump and come over from the other party. And this is how he treats her and Tucker Carlson, who is one of the intellectual architects of America First. Trump referred to him as a kook and just dismissed him and said he should just go get his own network, as Tucker Carlson is trying to bring Trump back to some semblance of reality. And this is, of course, the Trump we know. He'll step over any body to get to his objective, but he's lost now. He doesn't know where he's going, and his only guide is a foreign leader. And everyone in MAGA sees it. Everyone in America First sees it, that Trump is being led around blindly, buffoonishly by a foreign leader and is an ogre-like vehicle for his apocalyptic objective to incite a regional war.
Yeah, hard to disagree with that. They were talking about Tulsi Gabbard earlier, who briefed the U.S. Senate and said there's no evidence Iran has a nuclear weapon or any evidence they've even reconstituted their program since 2003. So yeah, Trump is going against both Tulsi and Tucker Carlson, who's trying to warn him against involvement in this war. We know the U.S. is already involved. You know, Trump is actually taking ownership of it in Truth Social posts. We know that the U.S. finances Israel and, you know, had a jump start on knowing this would happen several days in advance at the least. So he's right about that.
We're referring to Benjamin Netanyahu, who has always sought to guide the American president into this kind of disaster and has failed up until this point. He thought he had Trump by the short and curlies after he, through Mike Pompeo, got Trump to assassinate Qasem Soleimani. But Trump pulled back after seeing the attack on the Al-Assad base. But now something else is happening. Trump was relying heavily on Miriam Adelson's millions. He said that Sheldon and Miriam Adelson have visited him more than any other people in the White House. We're talking about over $600 million going into fueling Trump's career.
Yeah, he's boasted about that routinely, how much influence the Israel First lobby has over him, actually, how close he was aligned to Sheldon and Miriam Adelson. Miriam Adelson gave him $100 million in his last campaign, and it sure does seem like he's being led in the direction of the Israel lobby and exactly what Israel wants to do, just like they wanted the U.S. in Syria and Iraq and Libya and wanted them to bomb Yemen. We're back here again. It's square one. The neocons are back. They're triumphing. And Trump's basically taking ownership of this war now at this point. At first, he seemed distant, saying, you know, this is an Israel activity. But now, even he is claiming ownership. He saw several messages yesterday, including one that said, well, the supreme leader's safe right now. For now, you know, they can come back to the negotiating table. And then they evacuated Tehran, which has no nuclear enrichment facilities anyways, even those for nuclear power. That's all a civilian and government center. And it's a metropolis. It's the single metropolis in Iran. So obviously Trump is involved at this point.
Miriam Adelson has a vast network of spooks, goons, manipulators, and literal hitmen at her disposal. And Trump is not only bought and bossed, he's frightened. I believe he's frightened. I believe he's frightened that if he doesn't give in to Netanyahu at this moment, after 2 assassination attempts, that he himself could be at risk. Something odd is going on here. Trump previously mocked Barack Obama and mocked Marco Rubio for being under the influence and possibly Marco Rubio for being under Adelson's influence and Obama for being foolish enough to start a war with Iran.
And Trump Biden for bombing
exactly that. And he's throwing all the people who brought him to power under the bus publicly, humiliating them on behalf of a foreign leader. And if you just look at the America First influencers on social media, none of them are in favor of this. I went to the military parade, which was sort of a Trumpist political spectacle blended with the Army's 250th birthday. And I spoke to every person that I saw there with an America First hat on, with a red MAGA hat on. And I asked them, do you support the United States going to war for Israel? And none of them were enthusiastic. And many of them were disgusted with the idea. The veterans I spoke to were even more disgusted. And you can see even what's happening at the Pentagon. A U.S. Army colonel named Nathan McCormick was just removed from his position because he, using a semi-secret sock puppet account, had referred to the U.S. on social media as Israel's proxy. So Trump is basically imposing this war in an almost totalitarian fashion against his own base, and he's made no attempt to explain it to the American public whatsoever. Remember.
Yeah, absolutely. This is creating a schism within the MAGA movement. I'm seeing it. I'm not part of that movement, but I'm looking at influencers, what they're posting on Twitter. There's very low enthusiasm for this. You know, people like Charlie Kirk and some others have posted polls about, do you want the U.S. to be involved in this war? And they're so lopsided in the direction of not being involved in this war. Countless ones are, and I think this really jeopardizes the rest of Trump's agenda. Whatever else he wanted to do, solidify the protective tariffs, start mass deportations, which hasn't really happened outside of, deportations toward critics of Israel. We saw that in the Mahmoud Khalil story in Colombia. But yeah, this has big effects and ramifications for Trump, who expects to want to push his agenda forward in the first year of his second term. And I don't know. I think this, more than the schism between Elon Musk and Trump, is going to, plummet his numbers, dwarf his popularity, and really threaten what he wants to do. So I think Max is right about that.
The period after 9/11 and in the run-up to the Iraq War, the Bush communications team was acting in overdrive. They were doing everything they could to propagandize the American public. Right. This was the centerpiece of Bush's campaign for re-election. It's all we heard about was Saddam's WMD. Nothing like that is taking place. Trump just said, I don't even know what I will do. He's sort of an imperious figure hiding from the public right now, and no one even knows what's going to happen next. It's all up to Israel. The mask is off. Israel is leading the U.S.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with them. Now, there is a camp that thinks that those discussions with Iran, those negotiations to create a neo-JCPOA to curtail enrichment and allow for more inspections, the U.S. to verify it, etc., between the U.S. and Iran. But that seems to have been shut down at one point. And to what extent it was always a ruse is controversial, but I tend to think that it was earnest at first because they weren't putting on the table that you can't enrich uranium at all. They only changed and shifted that goalpost in that direction after the negotiations began, like kind of a midway point. And I think it's at that moment that they knew they were going to assist Israel in this bombing campaign, because that's a non-starter. That's a poison pill that Iran could not accept. They rely strongly on nuclear power, as all countries essentially have agreed that they can. They're a member of the IAEA and in compliance with it. Some people say, they've enriched their uranium to too high of a percentage. Well, I'd be up against that rim too if I was being bombed by Israel and the United States tried to overthrow my regime for the last 40 years or so. And they did so actually in 1953 under Operation Ajax. So this is where we're at. I think that the negotiations ended up being a ruse. It was a idea to lure Iranians into complacency, thinking that a strike wasn't coming. That's why I think they were able to take out some of the top brass in Iran in that residential area. That's the first area that Israel bombed, was residential areas. Of course, we shouldn't expect otherwise after what we've seen from Gaza, I suppose.
Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, the super MAGA conservative Republican congresswoman, supporter of Trump, of which, by the way, Chris Leonard is a loyal constituent, has been posting. I had to get that in there. That's producer Chris, for those of you not familiar with Chris's last name, has been posting against the war. And this just in from Jeff Sachs, the IAEA chief, a two-bit political hack, if ever there was one, on the payroll of Mossad, admits this morning, just 15 minutes ago, that the UN watchdog has no evidence to support claims that Iran is making a systematic effort to develop nuclear weapons. Who in the world would believe Trump and Netanyahu in light of this?
Well, and one of the talking points that's been going out from Trump to his coterie of right-wing influencers that we've seen repeated by the more pliable, avaricious ones who are dependent on Trump for their fame and fortune, like Charlie Kirk, whose entire career was fueled by pro-Israel billionaires, but who has now expressed some serious reservations about going to war. One of the talking points is that what the U.S. will merely do is a surgical strike using the mother of all bombs at Fordo, and then it will all be over. And that's Netanyahu's ruse for Trump, is to get the U.S. involved, to then trigger Iranian attacks on U.S. bases, which will bring the U.S. up the escalation ladder, could lead to U.S. casualties, calls for revenge from fanatical Israel firsters in Trump's camp like Mark Levin, and put Trump in a corner where he can't get out of this war. That's the point. It's not about, so my point is, this is not about the nuclear issue. It's not about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons is just the trigger point, as Iraqi WMD was in the lead up to that war. This war is about regime change. And we saw that on day one with Israel's unprovoked surprise attack, which was a decapitation strike aimed at the leadership of the IRGC and nuclear scientists. And Israel has been pushing Trump to assassinate the leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, which would be just received as a massive insult by millions and millions of Iranians. This is about regime change. What Netanyahu wants is regime change. He wants to remove the last powerful country in the region that is willing to stand up with dignity against his occupation apartheid regime, what he's doing to the Palestinians, and refuses to accept the protection racket of the United States military, which puts bases in their country in order and protects them, protects their oil fields. Iran just won't go along with it. So it's about destroying the entire political system of Iran, and then it's about looting the state of Iran.
Yeah, I just want to chime in here because it seems like Israel's plan to lure the U.S. into this conflict, into this war, into this strike has worked. And that stands regardless of whether you think the negotiations were a ruse or not, or whether you think they were honest or not. Because even if they were honest, it did undermine U.S. foreign policy objectives that were stated. We want a deal with Iran, said Trump. They were having rounds and rounds of negotiations. There are going to be additional rounds of negotiations after the strike. I think the day after in Bahrain, there was going to be a continuation of those negotiations. But even if that was the case, if Israel had kind of undercut the United States in this strike, this timed opportunistic strike, Trump's basically just gone along with it. Now, if this were any other country, Trump would just be irate. Like, this is an ally that's doing this to us? They've undermined our ability to negotiate with Iran through the strike in that case. But no, he's taking ownership of it, boasting about it, saying, tons of Iranians are going to die and more if they don't come to the table now. Well, who's going to trust you now? So we'll have to see how this all pans out. But I have to agree with Max here. It sure seems like Netanyahu took a real risk, saying that, I'm going to do this regardless of whether they want these negotiations or not. And I'm going to bet on the fact that Trump's going to come along with us. And Trump so far has done that.
As Saddam Hussein sought to do when he launched his war on Iran and occupied the province of Khuzestan, the most oil-rich province of Iran, in 1980. That's why the Shah's fail son, is being put up as the next leader of Iran by Israel, by the U.S., it's because he will sell off the country's resources. And we can see what's happening in Syria. So let's not be confused about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons is just a trick being deployed by Netanyahu to get the U.S. involved in a much wider project that will lead to the dissolution of any order in that region and a migration crisis in Europe like we've never seen before.
Yeah, I have to agree. And also outside of that region, because Iran is a BRICS country, it's an ally of Russia. What makes us think this will make our negotiations go better with Ukraine? And outside of that, the whole world's watching this. Putin sees this. So how would you establish in good faith negotiations that would lead to a peace in Ukraine over this? You saw the duplicity here. At least in a few days in advance, Trump knew this strike was coming and still announced that he wanted negotiations with Iran to take place that next day. What does this say to our partners across the world that, the U.S. funds? You can't really trust them. It's the U.S. and Israel against the world in many cases. And, I think this seriously not only jeopardizes the rest of Trump's agenda, but also any chance of peace soon in Ukraine.
Is there any question in your mind but that Trump and Netanyahu connived with Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia to create in the international community the false impression that the negotiations were serious and at the same time, the Israelis were planning to and did, of course, succeed in assassinating the Iranian negotiators.
Yeah, Israel assassinated Ali Shamkhani, who was the lead negotiator for the leader of Iran, who was pledging to make serious compromises for a deal, just as they assassinated every negotiator for Hamas, every single one. This is what Israel has done all the way back to the 70s with the PLO. We've done an analysis of Trump and his brain at the gray zone with our investigative technology and found that 83% of it is currently bong water. Trump doesn't.
I did not see that coming from Max. That was completely out of left field. It's hilarious, but that was just interjected in the middle of all this serious talk. It's pretty funny, man.
Trump doesn't have the capacity to connive with a figure like Netanyahu. He's mentally very lazy. And what took place was Trump was manipulated and possibly intimidated into getting to where he is right now.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with this, but I do think he's able to connive, but just we know the outcome will be one in the pro-Israel direction. We know how tied he is to the Israel lobby, like we just talked about earlier. He boasts about it. And I think it was John Mearsheimer who said that Trump's in a proverbial straitjacket because even if he really wanted to go against what Israel's doing, the lobby is immensely powerful. It's more powerful than a lot of the power that Trump has, and that counteracts, even if he had better instincts on foreign policy related to Iran, even if he wanted to go through those things, he's being controlled by forces that are unelected. It's the bureaucracy that, funds these wars, supports them, holds our elected officials accountable for voting against them. If you want to look at the most bipartisan measures, essentially in history, look at U.S. votes for aid to Israel, because that's the uniparty in action. For all the theatrics about how different, the left and right are in America, the liberals and conservatives, whatever you want to call it, that diaphragm, that left-right dichotomy, they sure are aligned on this for the most part. It does split parts of the distant right for sure, but man, even if Trump wanted to go against it, it might not be possible. And John Mearsheimer makes a really good case for that recently in some of his interviews, and also talks about that in his book, The Lobby. Highly recommended book.
But the reason that we're talking about this possible connivance is because of what Netanyahu wants us to believe. We're being manipulated too. How did that story get out into the public? It came through Netanyahu's top mouthpiece at Israel's main media channel, Channel 12, Amit Segal, who began leaking from an Israeli or reporting, citing an Israeli source, which obviously was Netanyahu, that Donald Trump was using negotiations as cover for this attack in order to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security.
Yeah, that's how that story originated, and I think this point is great. Few others are making this point, but it seems like that was intentionally leaked to bring Trump into this war, to let out the news that he was in on it, even if that was false for some reason, which it doesn't look to be, at least for a few days in front of the attack, and we've known for months they've wanted to attack. Actually, there was news in mainstream media, corporate media outlets a few months ago where it said, Trump had essentially stopped a war with Iran because his cabinet was split on it and he sided with those that didn't want it. Well, ultimately, he obviously sided with those that did want it. And it seems like Netanyahu and the Israelis put this story out in advance to draw the U.S. into it.
While it's true that the Iranians were lulled, and that was a major mistake on their part, very foolish, Donald Trump, Netanyahu was leaking that story or floating that story out there through his main guy in the Israeli media in order to create the sense inside Iran that the U.S. was directly engaged in the decapitation assault on day one so that Iran would begin attacking U.S. bases and it would draw the U.S. in.
That is the biggest great point I think he's making here. That's the biggest fear that we should have, is that our U.S. soldiers in the Middle East, which they shouldn't be there in the first place, might get attacked, because that would guarantee that the U.S. is totally drawn into this war. That is what I think Israel was trying to do. That was their plan. That was the gambit they threw out there to try to make the Iranian regime convinced that the U.S. is totally on board with this. And, it's hard to deny that that's a good strategy. It's twisted and sick and demented, because what that says is that your chief ally in the Middle East actually has the incentive of U.S. soldiers dying, of that benefiting your cause by getting the U.S. into that war. And yeah, if that happened, I do think that there's no chance that the U.S. isn't directly involved and probably completely leading all of the strikes in this war and pushing to the end for regime change, which I ultimately do think they want regime change, and they're trying for regime change now regardless, but that would sure guarantee it from the American side. We also should fear a false flag attack where a non-Iranian force attacks U.S. forces, blames it on Iran, and the same result happens. That is to be feared.
Now, Donald Trump has been convinced since that attack, which was a very devastating attack, that Israel is winning. And now Trump wants to claim some modicum of credit for it. And he has referred to Israel as we, I think, in a Truth Social statement. It wasn't even in an interview. We also saw Ted Cruz, Tel Aviv Ted, one of the top recipients of AIPAC money in the Senate, in a interview in which he was being humiliated by Tucker Carlson, also refer to Israel as we. And they're both kind of giving away the game that the U.S. is involved militarily, but not at the level that Israel currently wants or needs.
So pronouns do matter in the end, it turns out.
Israel needs the U.S. This is an important point. Israel needs the U.S. to be more involved because Israel can't finish the war it started. Israel's attack may have succeeded initially, but at this point, and if you pay close attention even to the footage of Iranian missile strikes, retaliatory strikes on Israeli cities, you'll see that Israel's air defense systems are becoming exhausted. These are very expensive. They cost $285 million a night to operate, and we're paying for it. And Iran is getting through it with very increasingly small salvos of missiles, doing damage, and is able to target intelligence and military targets. The Washington Post, citing Israeli and U.S. officials, just reported that Israel will be exhausted and have to ration its air defenses in 10 to 12 days, which is something I've also been hearing. So Israel's actually failing. And the only question is how many more ballistic missiles Iran has left in store. The Israeli public, and I've been talking to some people I know on the ground there, is not tolerating this very well. And there is not the same rally around the flag effect that we're seeing in Iran, where even with deep grievances with the government are actually now demanding that Iran retaliate hard.
Yeah, hard to disagree with almost anything regarding what Max said here. whether you're in the camp of believing these negotiations with Iran were always a ruse or not, we're still in the same place. This is a war that the U.S. is directly involved with for Israel's sake, for Israel's desire for regime change that Netanyahu has called for so long, that the U.S. has planned, we know at least since 1996, because Wesley Clark walked into the Pentagon. He saw a memo regarding the clean break strategy. It had 7 countries in 5 years that the U.S. wanted to overthrow, and Iran was the last one on that list. Guess which one is the only one that hasn't been overthrown? It's Iran. So we're in the same place regardless. I tend to believe, if we're counting, I think these negotiations actually did begin in earnest, and they were undermined by the Israelis. That makes both parties complicit, don't get me wrong. And Trump has responded absolutely horribly. He's been drawn into Netanyahu's trap to involve the U.S. If U.S. soldiers get hit, they will be even more involved. But the U.S. is bankrolling this. Have no doubt about that. The U.S. is using interceptor missiles. We've already seen that happen in this conflict. This unprovoked strike by Israel. You're never going to hear Iran has the right to defend itself, but actually that was guaranteed. Iran was going to retaliate. It's going to cause mass deaths. This could lead to a greater Middle East war, a more expanded regional war that the U.S. should play no part in, especially when we have a proxy war going on in Ukraine right now against a nuclear power that also Trump has said he wants to negotiate a peace to. Well, I'm relatively unconvinced about that too, because he won't withdraw all aid to Zelensky. This jeopardizes so much. It really has the chance to just sink Trump's presidency completely, even among his base. If I was a Trump supporter, this would be the last issue I want to be focused on, but it is dominating the news. It's going to jeopardize his chance to do deportations or tariffs, and regardless of what you think about those policies and whether they're good ideas, I think this is really going to divide the right in a way that nothing else has so far this presidency. I think we're seeing that from some of the top influencers, like he said, Charlie Kirk. I'm seeing like the Hodge twins, and all sorts of people have problems with this, major problems. And even if they repeat the propaganda, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, a lot of people don't want to be involved in this war. Trump was wrong not to trust his hand-picked DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, that he pushed through the Senate, whipped senators to vote in favor of. She only was confirmed by the narrowest of margins, and for him to say, I don't care what she says, I think they're close to having one. Well, what's your evidence to the contrary? There's been no evidence brought up, and I don't care what the globalists at the UN say. Great, if they agree that Iran isn't trying to obtain a nuclear weapon, awesome. But that notwithstanding, the America First solution is not to get bogged down in this war. Who cares what the globalists say? I know what's true based upon the fact that even the CIA, the entity most likely to drum up war propaganda, actually isn't in this case. And Trump can reject that to the Americans' peril, but I'm going to stand against it the whole time. But I want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Is Max Blumenthal right? Did these negotiations ever start out in an earnest way and then transition into, a dupe of Iran for the sake of Israel? Or do you think they were always from the get-go a ruse, and this plan had taken place a long time and was going to happen regardless? Let me know in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron to support me. I'd really appreciate that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and my favorite, no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.